On January 5th, 2022, I uploaded my very first YouTube video. Now, that video and the video after it were two of the most important and foundational videos to my YouTube channel that I was trying to build at the time. Those two videos may not make sense to the average person as to how they relate to the conversation around true crime, but I was trying to introduce new listeners to why I wanted to make a true crime channel the way that I wanted to make it. No one was doing it like me, Buki. The videos are still on the YouTube. Click the link in the bio and check them out. My very first video centered around January 6th. In fact, it was titled January 6th, 1 year later. The reason why I wanted to start there for a true crime YouTube channel was simply because I started to notice within the subsequent few months of January 6th how the conversation was starting to shift actively, how it was starting to be dismissed, denied. The distance was starting to be put between those people and what they did, and how illegal it was, and how insane it was, and how historic it was. People were already downplaying it on network news stations, and they were allowed to by both sides of the media without any recourse. Those left-leaning or those democratic-leaning institutions were inviting these cuckoo crazy people on who were willing to argue back and forth about whether or not January 6th was illegal, whether it was a crime. And of course, they allowed it. One thing Democratic media can't deny is their hunger to dunk on people that they perceive to be stupider than them. They allowed this conversation to be amplified by these real news publications, and then have the nerve to be actively surprised that we are on December 17th, 2024, about to enter our second Trump presidency. And they don't see anything wrong with it. There is a mechanism that gets employed when things happen in this country. It happened with Pearl Harbor. It happened with World War II. It happened with 9/11. These things that could get employed, these dusty mechanisms and cogs that start to work as these historic things happen. And it's this unconscious PR agency that begins to shape and mold the story in order to make sure that white people do not see that they are the problem. It happens at the micro level. It happens at the macro level. Every time there's a school shooting, as soon as there's a school shooting, what do we talk about? Mental health. No one is saying the quiet part out loud that we have a white male mediocrity entitlement problem in this country. The statistics show it, but no one's wanting to say it because the myth-making process is well at work. He was a loner. He was mentally ill. His parents were divorced. His parents were addicts. All of these stories come out of the woodwork to try and humanize this individual, right? The same things get employed when historical moments happen at the macro level. The same PR agencies start running their mouths to curb the story, to curb the truth and the impact of the story, the impact of what these people have done. In that first video, I talk about white myth making. I share an example, which I will share with you in a second. And I watch and react to the documentary 4 Hours at the Capitol, which is on HBO. And I do that deliberately so people who watch that video can look at how people were talking about January 6th a year later and actually confront the violence and the reality of the situation that was January 6th by the people on the ground. In that video, I discuss George Washington's wooden teeth. Okay, now this is something that has been a part of the American cultural zeitgeist. If you weren't taught this in school, you may be a little too young. I don't know if they did their revisionist history thing, in the history books yet, but I know that a kid who was born in 96, I was taught in elementary school that George Washington had wooden teeth. Type it down in the comments. If you're watching this, comment on this video, 5-star this podcast episode if you know what I'm talking about and if you were also taught the same thing. Not only was I taught this in school, it was suspiciously around the time that we were learning about the cherry tree and Honest Abe and Johnny Appleseed and these myths and these folk stories about the American identity. George Washington having wooden teeth was taught so prolifically in schools that it was in our cartoons as well. The Fairly Odd Parents had an episode referencing it, and many other cartoons had many episodes referencing it. They reference it in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. The concept that a man would have wooden dentures. And to be frank, it never really sat right with me because logistically, it just doesn't make sense. I'm sure people did it, but the first president, or who we consider the first president of the United States having wooden teeth never made sense to me. And that video was posted on January 5th, 2022. About a year prior to that, I was confronted with the truth. George Washington didn't have wooden teeth. That's ridiculous. His teeth were pulled out of the mouth of his slaves. There was also a combination of ivory, plaster, other things, but he had slave teeth in his mouth. In fact, if you really wanted to, you could go to a museum in DC and see his actual dentures. They're on display there. If you're watching the visual, I'll put a picture in. When I learned that, because people like to say, Black people are too detail-oriented, it's too small, you're too petty, everything's a big deal to y'all. But when a country is willing to lie and teach young, impressionable children this small detail, just remove it and replace it with something else. When they're willing to do that, you need to understand that the devil is in the details. They're as invested in the details as much as we're as invested in the details. And to not be invested in the details is how y'all get played every fucking time. So I come to you and I ask you, okay, so we have all this iconography. We have all of this imagery, all these symbols of who the founding fathers of this country are, what they were like. Why do you think they didn't tell us that his teeth were slave teeth? Why do you think they didn't tell us the truth? To me, it's probably related to the fact that it's not until we're in middle school that we actually come to the fact and to the understanding that these founding fathers, actually, a lot of them owned slaves. That information isn't given to you initially when you're growing up as a kid. They have to stuff you full of American patriotic bullshit before you get soured to the truth, right? It's not until about middle school you start hearing the other things about these people that are hailed as freedom fighters and have federal holidays named after them. Why do you think they didn't want you to know that they owned slaves? Is it because it would completely go against what they are hailed for? So much of how we live our life is shrouded in hypocrisies. So much of how they police us is shrouded in hypocrisies. And at the same time that people are pointing at Black people or people of color for paying attention to the details and paying attention to the signs, they're spinning a web of lies. George Washington did not have wooden teeth. He had slave teeth in his mouth. Welcome to Bloodstained, episode 8. George Washington had slave teeth. Let's talk about it. In this episode, we're going to talk about something called neo-slavery. Now, this is going to be less feelings and opinion based than some of my previous few podcast episodes. This is going to be more timeline based. We're going to be talking about things in more of a historic narrative because I think it's just so important that we all learn and understand about this time period, this very small sliver of time called the neo-slavery time period. This is a time period in history where it's the end of the year, it's summer, the book is closed and you're watching documentaries in class. This is a part of the semester when we finished everything that we needed to teach you about, and we're just going to skip over this part. This is a part in average K through 12 education that does not get discussed. And people can say it's a school system. People can say that it's because there's not enough time in the year to cover everything. But what I truly believe is that it's purposely not taught to people in order to keep us divided and to keep us ignorant about our histories and how they fit into the American conversation. Neo-slavery is that time after Reconstruction in the South. The transitional time that allowed slavery to rebrand to what it is today. The time off, the time out of the spotlight to reshape it, clean it up, and throw it out as if it's a new product. Slavery never ended, y'all. I don't know if y'all knew that. In the 13th Amendment, there is baked in a loophole that was almost instantly exploited. This time is not told to you, so you can't connect to Black people on a human level. It is intentionally not taught to you in schools so that you look at Black people confused when they talk about how slavery never ended, when they talk about how they're still oppressed, when they talk about how the same systems that were oppressing them before still exist and are alive and well, when we're talking about how we're in an active genocide. This is the part where y'all look at us and say, slavery ended 400 years ago. I don't know what you're talking about. This is that part. Because in our legacy, in our history, there's no gaps. There's no gaps. We know what happened. We know what happened. We know what continues to happen. And that's how we share information. Y'all are the ones that don't know. Y'all are the ones that don't know the truth of how this shit worked. So this episode is going to be more educational. It's going to be less opinion-based. Of course, I'm going to throw my opinion in there. How can I not? But we're going to really hammer home that time period so that people can actually sit there and understand that it never ended. It just had time to rebrand into something else. We've always been exploited. It's always been the same level of exploitation across history. And that is why Black people are always loud and are always fighting for our right. White myth-making erases things. White myth-making creates things. White myth-making creates a white savior in a situation where there were none. White myth-making comforts white people in the reality that it just wasn't that bad and it was just of the times. And it's the shaping of history, omission of the truth, that allows us to live in a world where slavery never ended, but we pretend that it did. That allows us to live in a society where some Black people have deluded themselves to think that we will one day be accepted. I mean, not to go off on a rant this early on, but there's a whole point that can be made about respectability politicking and how that relates to a lack of understanding fundamentally of the long, straight line, straight arrow of how exploitation never ended and how you playing into respectability politics is not actually helping Black people. And how you policing your own community to fit into white standards of being is not revolutionary. You know you can still be killed, or you should know. This conditioning is so behind the scenes and so well executed that there are certain Black people that don't even think, that don't even realize that the smiles that we put on, the code switching that we do is 100% forced at gunpoint. There was never a time, for real, where we were actually thriving in this country without fear. There was never a time of peace. There was never a time of rest. There was never a time where that existed. So for Black people to adopt white language and say that was so long ago, you're too dramatic. You're victims. Now see, let me shut up. Because I was about to go on a whole thing about the Haitian Revolution, because you know what they did to them folks. Okay. These are Crusades era talking points. This is a thing I say a lot on TikTok. This is a thing I say a lot on the podcast. Crusades era talking points. This racial hierarchy, this concept of purity associated with whiteness, this idea of blood and being pure and being closer to God, and the things that continue to underscore white supremacy are hundreds of years old. That they're old. Like, they're old. They're hundreds of years old. And it's worked so well that those same talking points can be pressed upon in our modern day 2024 and get Trump reelected. Slavery is a true crime story. We all know this. We've talked about it for the past 7 episodes. Slavery is a true crime story. But the real crime is a cerebral crime. It's a psychological conditioning. It's a lack of historical knowledge. It's the purposeful censorship of our truth and our history. It's a severing of story so that we look like we're crying wolf. We look like we're Chicken Little all the time, screaming that the sky is falling. And they make us look insane. But it's really y'all who don't know what's going on. You will know very soon. But it's really y'all who didn't know and didn't listen when it was pertinent for you to listen because of the conditioning. Being a Black woman, being Black in America is to constantly be yelling into the void, warning people of things that are going to occur, and no one listening to you or taking you seriously. No one thinking that you have the ability to think and deduce like that. People thinking that you're resting on the institution of slavery existing so much that you've become a victim in your lifestyle. That is a true crime story. Because what they're doing is creating a cycle of dehumanization, a cycle of people who are so desensitized to how America is how it is. The violence that is allowed in order for us to continue living the way that we do here. It allows for that. That's the point of shaping the story. So you are blind to the truth. They're promising you something with their fingers crossed. And white myth making is that unconscious, subtle thing that continues to exercise its control over us by separating us and allowing us to believe things that are just simply not true and not telling us pertinent information. Neo-slavery is one of those points. Because if people in general were taught about this specific transitional time period the way that they should be taught about it, I think we'd have a lot more solidarity and understanding amongst racial groups in this country. Just saying. Slavery is a true crime story, but the myths that we are fed about it is a bigger one because it forces all of us to be accessory to crimes without even knowing it. I think it's really important on this podcast and really responsible for us to understand that the Civil War is a moment in time that is mythologized so much. The North mythologizes it as we're on the right side of history. We are fighting for the souls of Black people. The South mythologizes it as we weren't bad people. We were fighting for states' rights. Both of these tellings of the story lack the truth. Because what they're doing is using the Civil War as a PR moment to project their beliefs on what they feel like should be discussed. The Civil War wasn't fought for Black people. It wasn't fought for our souls. It wasn't fought for our freedom. It was fought purely to keep the Union together. It wasn't until towards the end of the war when the North really needed the inspiration to get them through that next level, to get them through to fight the war to the end, that it got really inherently connected to this concept of slavery, this concept of fighting for Black people's rights to live, and how morally wrong and how morally bankrupted it was to own a human being. I want this also to be expressly clear. What we are told about Lincoln and his moral purity starting young, Honest Abe is a conversation that happens right next to George Washington's wooden teeth when we're young. The moral purity that we're sold about this man is not correct. Okay, I wish we could dig him up and talk to him directly and let y'all see how he didn't really fuck with us like that, for real. Nobody did, right? Lincoln admitted in a private letter that he didn't believe that United States could survive as a mixed union. He didn't believe that privately, even though he is branded as some morally pure champion who saw the humanity in Black people. In fact, he didn't believe this so much that he was working on shipping off all the former slaves to somewhere in South America and naming it Lincolnonia. Right? Which is very similar to what the American government did with Liberia. And that was a huge failure, of course. Go look it up. There's a great book called House at Sugar Beach that talks about it from a personal perspective. I've read and reread that book multiple times. But yeah, he was going to try and ship a soft child. Like, they were working different options. Because he fundamentally didn't believe that the country could heal past this reality of slavery and that the people could get along in a way that the Union could continue. And I kind of think he was right. The conditioning that came out of slavery for decades and decades and hundreds of years was hard to undo. And of course, instead of standing firm and trying to undo that and saying, hey, we need to confront this and we need to teach people, we need to heal through this so we can actually maybe on the other side be a mixed race union, he was finna send us down to South America and have us figure it out with the locals there. No one is morally pure because regardless of his intentions and whether he actually had his heart set behind the idea that we could be a mixed race union or if he was whispering behind the scenes that he didn't believe it, we became that, not perfectly, not morally, not ethically in a lot of ways, but we became that. Regardless of whether Lincoln's heart was really into ending slavery or not, or whether it was a PR stunt, it ended. It ended. For those listening, I'm doing air quotes. It ended in that formal sense, right? Because of actions that he took. And this is why I think it's just such a foolish idea to symbolize a lot of these people instead of taking their historic contributions at face value. We don't need to add all this Honest Abe, all this morally pure Abe stuff to his name. He did what he did and it had the effects that it did. And we can talk about that in a nuanced way. We can talk about how he owned slaves. We can talk about these things. We can talk about how the founding fathers weren't necessarily the people who knew exactly right from wrong because they didn't. They were people living in a specific time. And if we were able to take history at face value, a lot of us would have way more complex thinking skills and would be working that critical thinking skill a lot more instead of having it chewed up and spit out and bird fed to us in a very specific way. We don't need symbols. We just need people to record what happened. Symbols are for losers. One of the main reasons why our ancestors weren't packed up on a ship and shipped off to South America to Lincolnia land or whatever is because Frederick Douglass came to Lincoln and convinced him it wasn't the right thing to do. Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 came through. And though many of these points would not be ratified until later on, the main point was that now Black men could enlist and fight on behalf of the Union and help end this war. This is another part that I just want to say really quick. Black people have been fighting in y'all's wars since the beginning of time. I don't care what the Alamo movie shows you. I don't care what these old Revolutionary War things show you. We have have been next to you, fighting side by side with you for the same things that you were making us fight for. We've risked our lives for this country as well from the beginning. And the way that you treat Black veterans and historically have as a culture, as a society, as a government should be studied, and you should be shamed publicly for that. They entered in the war. 1863 helped end the war. And in 1865, while the 13th Amendment was being drafted, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15. This divided up 400,000 acres of abandoned land along the Georgia coast to be split up and given to formerly enslaved individuals. This is where the saying 40 acres in a mule comes from. And a lot of people don't realize that they were very far in this endeavor before it got taken back. The 40 acres in a mule comes in, and people were actually given deeds to 40 acres in a mule. This was actually happening. People were actually preparing. The land was already parceled off, and some people got that land. According to Special Order 15, each family was to be given 40 acres and a mule, aka reparations for the work put into this country. I wonder how much 40 acres in a mule goes for these days, including interest, for sure. I wonder how much that is. Again, I want to pause this and say, I always say generational wealth is really generational debt. Your legacy has borrowed from marginalized people, specifically enslaved people and Native American people, for a very, very long amount of time. The wealth and the access and the head start that you get from our direct detriment is just piling up interest. And eventually those debts will become due. And I'm not kidding. Eventually those debts will become due, and you'll be looking around like, how does this relate to me? Go look at the head of your line. Go look at the Mayflower people. Go look at those people in your past that stole and took and demonized and killed and enslaved to answer that question for you, because you're borrowing from us, and it's time for them debts to start getting paid back. Just saying. In March 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was established in order to protect the rights of the formerly enslaved in the South. Now, they did a lot of good work. They did a lot of good things in the South to try and integrate Black people, formerly enslaved Black people, and protect their newfound rights in America. The Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865, and Lincoln publicly suggested that Black men who fought in the war should be given the privilege to vote in elections, because they fought for the war, right? Well, John Wilkes Booth caught wind of this information and killed him. As a result of Lincoln being shot in that theater, on April 14th, 1865, Andrew Johnson, a white supremacist Democrat who Lincoln ran with in good faith to balance out the ticket like they still do now, to show a spirit of reconciliation with the South, became president. And within 6 months, he ordered that land that was already parceled out and some of it given to Black people who were formerly enslaved be taken back and given to white people instead. All those parcels of land were reallocated to white ownership instead. Now, I don't think people understand how quick of a succession that is. Like, people aren't really understanding that. When we're taught about this, we're taught about these specific isolated moments. We're taught about the Emancipation Proclamation. We're talking about, the end of the Civil War. We talk about the 13th Amendment. We talk about all of these individual things. But it's hard for people to really conceptualize how fast this was happening and how fast America was changing post the war ending. Did you hear that time period? April 9th, 1865 is when the war ended, and Lincoln was publicly suggesting that Black men who fought in the war deserved the right to vote. He was murdered by the 14th. He was assassinated by the 14th. And all of those things that could have really changed the trajectory of this country, the potential unity of this country, who knows what could have happened had Black people been given the chance, the 40 acres of the mule, had Black people been given the actual right to vote then and there. So much could have changed. But instead, on the 14th of April, Andrew Johnson took power and revoked that and said the white people get it. This is where we start to see the creation of white privilege. This is where we start to see a lot of these things start to happen, right? Because I think had our ancestors been given 40 acres and a mule, I don't think you'd ever forgive. I don't think you'd ever forget, but at least you could possibly have something to pass down to your family. At least something came out of that in terms of the generations of your people that were born into slavery. Like I said at the top, how much is 40 acres and a mule with interest from 1865? How much is that running us these days? These are moments in time that create the wealth cap, that create the white privilege that white people like to say that they didn't have. You did have it. Someone in your family line squandered it, but you did have it, and you still do have it. All of that reconciliation work that was supposed to happen post-slavery ending, gone. And again, not saying that Lincoln particularly cared about Black people, but you could see that he was trying to make some ends meet for clearly the fact that these people were enslaved for years and years and years. But on top of that, they fought for the Union on behalf of the Union. And you're not going to give them anything. Okay. But do they tell you that part? No. Point me to a point in American history where white men were exceptional without cheating. Hello? Point me to that point in American history when that happened without cutting down someone at their knees. They were just naturally successful. They were just naturally better. I'm waiting. Okay. This era is a beginning of presidential reconstruction. Okay, so it's very bare bones, and it's not really about healing the wounds. It's about kind of being like, let's get this over with so that we can move on. I don't care about what these Blacks think about what they deserve. We're trying to just cross our T's, dot our I's enough so we can, as a country, move on as a union. We're not really trying to do right by these people, and we're really not trying to heal our bigotry and racism that came out of this institution that's been pivotal to the creation of wealth in this country, to pivotal to making this little experiment of a country come out on the global stage with a booming economy. Let's not talk about the details of that and trying to make peace with that and heal through that. Let's just do what we have to do in order to move forward. Once the 13th Amendment was officially ratified in 1865, Andrew Johnson thought that that should be the end of Reconstruction. That's it. The 13th Amendment. Now, if you've been on my channel, another shameless plug, I have a YouTube video where I'm reacting to 13th, the documentary that I watch quite often. I do really enjoy talking specifically about the details of the 13th Amendment that people don't be talking about, okay? The loopholes that are instantly, this was ratified in 1865, child. Again, so much happened in 1865. Can we just, a lot was going on in 1865. The loophole was baked in immediately that, no one should be enslaved, except for, criminals. And do you think they just let that loophole sit untouched? Do you think that loophole was not going to be exploited immediately? The same year slavery was officially abolished, they found another way to make slavery legal. Ciao. Many of these newly freed people were forced to return back to the same fields that they were enslaved in, forced into signing labor contracts that essentially signed their rights away once again, because of course, things stack. It's important to understand that choices stack. So this active choice to make sure that the enslaved population was illiterate, it sans a few people, made the conditionality for them to be continuously exploited for years to come. So these people were signing labor contracts, not realizing that the conditions that they were signing for were very much the same. Some of these farms had these people back in chains, treating them, not allowing them to eat, not caring about their medical needs. This was not good work. This was not at all anything different than slavery and how they were treated. And again, another part that doesn't get talked about enough in history. In name, technicality alone, it wasn't slavery. But how is it not slavery when it is exactly slavery? It's just not called that anymore. And, again, another rant. This is why I hate people like Destiny. This is why I hate people like Ben Shapiro, because they're the semantic technicality police. They don't actually know shit, because you're actually dumb if you do not add into the conversation emotions, social expectations, some of the things that are not just black and white. So yes, technically slavery ended. Racialized chattel slavery ended in 1865. For those listening, I'm doing air quotes. Sure, whatever. But if you make something that it resembles exactly what slavery was, but just don't call it that, did it really go anywhere? I hate those people who talk like that and think like that. Like, you aren't even attached to reality. That is nowhere near to how real life works at all. There are double standards. There are nuances. Nothing is black and white. And you're sitting here going to argue with somebody who's well-versed in understanding and holding multiple truths in their hand at the same time, and understanding how things actually work and can be applied out of the book into real life. And they think they're winning these arguments because they think they're catching you in something by admitting that their technicalities could be technically true. That's not a real win. You're just a loser, and you're annoying, and everyone hates you and thinks you're ugly. Now, obviously, this was quickly seen as exploiting, the loopholes. Too obviously exploiting the loopholes, right? You're taking people, you're exploiting the fact that they don't know how to read or write. You're making them sign away their life so that they could be enslaved by you once again. And that's not right, because that's not the loophole in the 13th Amendment. Duh. The loophole is these people have to be criminals. The fuck? These people have to be bad people, and we have to put some effort into categorizing them as dangerous and criminal before you can then allow them to work for you for free and treat them like shit. You're not doing the proper process. So because of that was quickly kind of stamped out. People quite obviously saw the irony that slavery ended, but then slavery is back, in this way. And generals from the army were stationed in specific regions in the South to make sure that they were keeping up with what the federal government was saying we were going to do to move past this ugly little point in time called slavery. It was obvious through that process that they couldn't just let Southern people, Southern economy, Southern whatever, just rely on their own devices in their moral code to keep slavery outside of, their existence, to do right by the people that they formerly enslaved. So they had to force governmental enforcement. So Congress created the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which Johnson, of course, vetoed, but Congress vetoed to override his veto. So it didn't, whatever his issues with it didn't matter, because it still was able to pass. And it had much of the same wording as the 14th Amendment, which would be ratified 2 years after that in 1868. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 officially ended the quick and dirty Presidential Reconstruction Act and entered us into the radical Reconstruction era, which is what we usually kind of refer back to when we're talking about Reconstruction. It's stratified by different eras. So in 1867, we enter into the real radical Reconstruction era. Now, this is where they kind of went ham on the South. And we'll talk about my feelings about how they went about this. But the former Confederate states were separated into 5 military districts, right? So no longer were the normal borders the normal borders. They were separated into 5 military districts that were each controlled by a general that was appointed, to come down from, the greater American government to enforce the laws of allowing Black people to exist as people. It also required the Southern government to ratify the 14th Amendment, which they would not be doing had the military not had their guns trained at their heads, forcing them to do it, right? So here we come. There's no middle ground. Right? There's no wanting to heal and have conversations and be diplomatic and try and explain and show and prove and say. There's no in between. It's either we leave them to their own devices and it's slavery, or we really come in hard and heavy, not caring about the optics of what this may look like and how that might affect things in the end, right? It's either this or that. It's black or white. There's no nuance. There's no level of trying to, educate people at all. It's just forced immediately. And of course, a group of people who just lost a war, who are humiliated by this, who claim and rewrite history that it was for states' rights, is not going to take kindly to the United States Army being forced back in their face to make sure that they live their lives in a very specific way that they just naturally don't agree with. They fought a whole war against, right? So here we go. So, of course, Andrew Johnson vetoed this bill like he vetoed the last one, but it was overridden by Congress again and it was pushed through. And because of this bill going through, 38,000 federal troops were deployed to these districts in the South, and half of those people were Black. KKK resurgence instantly. KKK, not resurgence, KKK being created instantly as a result of this. Now, again, we walk a fine line here because hindsight is 2020. I understand the reasoning behind it because they knew that people were trying to take advantage and put Black people back into slavery. But it's about the finesse. It's about the optics about certain things. And this community of people had just fought a war about not wanting to be controlled, so they say. Obviously, the conversation was about slavery and centered in slavery. But as they say it, they didn't want the government to control what they did or didn't do when it came to their economy and how they made their money. So in response to that, to send 38,000 federal troops to be in their face to say, you're doing that wrong, you can't do that, we're arresting you because you're violating this, and half of them being Black and maybe probably formerly enslaved. How do you think the average Southern person in the 1860s was going to take that? Do you think they were going to take it in stride and say, oh, they're just doing what's best for the Union? These people did fight. They do deserve respect. No, they created the KKK because of that. And now we have another fucking problem. Now we have angry white people who are even more stubborn, who are even more planted in not accepting the new way of life, not accepting that slavery is over. They're even more resolute and they're willing to die behind it, which they've proven because they fought a war behind that shit. So they're willing to do it again. People don't talk about this. Like, think about this. When you think about learning about Civil War, Reconstruction, and all of these things, they teach it to you in a way where you don't understand how it fits into the context of history. They teach it to you like Reconstruction had these tenets. Yeah. And then it was over. And then there was 40 acres in the meal, and then there wasn't. And there was the Emancipation Proclamation, and then this happened. They don't tell you the connecting details. They just say this happened, this happened, this happened. He was murdered, so this guy came into presidency. They don't talk about how the difference of opinion directly affected the material circumstances and the potential upward mobility of the formerly enslaved in this country. They don't want you to know about it. They don't want you to draw the connections that a lot of the conditionalities that Black people are a part of right now, their situations, are not of their own choices. It's these choices that stack, The fact that they decided to not let Black people read caused them to be illiterate and signing their life away to be enslaved again. You know what I mean? The fact that they send these troops in at this very specific time that's very tender and sensitive is directly, in the KKK, is a direct response to that. The way they tell these certain points in history is as if they happen in a vacuum, as if they're not related and directly in conversation with each other all the time. It's annoying because then you can see, okay, there is a lily pad. There is a narrative structure as to why these things happen. They didn't just happen in a vacuum. People didn't just start the KKK because they wanted to. It was a direct response to how post-slavery, post-Civil War, things were being handled in terms of healing the South and getting the South up to where it needs to be. And I'm going to walk a line. I just talk shit about people playing devil's advocate. I've talked shit about people playing devil's advocate a lot, but I will offer, and extend a little bit of devil's advocate. If this is how the economy has been running, and now you're taking their free labor so they're not able to have as much money or have such a profitable business structure, I think that trying to find real material ways to help these people transition into other industries, to bring in some of those industrial industries to the South and help them transition, I think really focusing on the economic aspect of how we are going to bridge that gap from agricultural to industrial in the South specifically may have relaxed a few people, because I do think that a lot of their fear, because I do think a lot of this fear and hatred, obviously it's based in racism and white supremacy, but it's also based in the fear that they don't know how this is going to affect how they've been living. And if people were upfront about how to bridge those gaps and how to figure things out, and if people were more transparent about how that exact economic breakdown was going to affect these people, good or bad or whatever, maybe we'd have a different result even then. It's the lack of understanding in general of the real circumstances that people are in. We look back at these histories and we can have 2020 hindsight about it. I understand that, but it's just really important that we sit there and say, I would be freaked out if I was taught that I was the best and all of these things, and now there's a Black federal troop in my face with a gun telling me that I'm doing shit wrong. I would be mad. I would start a secret organization. You know what I'm saying? Like, there is a thought process as to why people think this way. These people were not necessarily purely evil people. These people were people responding to a time that they are unfamiliar with, and the American government doing a bad job of bridging the gap and quelling the fear and anxieties of what this new era would be, and kind of coming down very harshly in this way that, fucks up people's perceptions. I know people are going to be like, you're giving credence to slave owners. I'm not giving credence. I'm just begging you to see the truth of the context. I'm begging you to see the truth of the situation, that this was happening and all of this relates to each other. The KKK was formed on Christmas Eve in 1865, but they can really trace their origins as an armed militia group funded by the Confederacy who would patrol the countryside looking for deserters and runaway slaves. Now, just a little self-plug once again. I'm going to self-plug myself. I have a Substack. Link in the bio, babe. We've been working. We're working. I have a Substack. And in that Substack, there's a free tier and there's a paid tier. In the paid tier, I am watching slave movies for you. The paid tier is $5 a month, $50 for the year. Get into it. I reacted to The Birth of a Nation. That's my very first one. The first one's for you. You can also find this reaction on my YouTube channel. But this time period that I'm kind of touching on is a time period that's often mythologized and discussed by white people in a very opposite way. And Birth of a Nation was one of those movies that reified this want for white people to not feel as bad for losing in the Civil War. And it's an extension of that idea. And if you're interested in watching me react to slave movies, I've reacted to a bunch. I'm in the middle of my Roots series. I have to edit and upload a couple more episodes, but link in the bio, subscribe, $5 a month, $50 for the year. Love you. Let's get into it. First one's free though. Find it on my YouTube page. When the war was over, the KKK, or the militia group that could be traced to becoming the eventual KKK, turned into a guerrilla warfare group, and they would hunt down Union soldiers and eventually turn to terrorism as a means to an end. And during this specific time, many family members and people who were a part of the Freedmen's Bureau were lynched. Yep. Yeah. To the point where a lot of people don't know the exact number. And again, this is part of white myth making, a part of white lies, a part of white bullshit, where, obviously we have the pictures to prove that this time happened, but the details are fuzzy. And because the devil's in the details, that allows for them to kind of, sweep past how disgusting that is. Let's get even more grimy with it. Okay. The only way former slaves could have a taste of freedom was if the federal government and federal troops were deployed in the South. When it comes to lynching, also, lynching was such a part of the culture at that point in time that kids would be let out of school early so they wouldn't miss a lynching. People would eat food and watch someone get lynched. This is another level of depravity. This is another level of being devoid of any humanity. And that was normalized. That violence, that public violence was normalized. It was encouraged. Photos were taken. People were proud of it. The postcards were made of that shit. So in the 1868 election, there were federal troops that were stationed at every polling station, because this is when that three-fifths compromise started to bubble up and be a thing. Black people in the South were required to vote in order to widen their hold on Congress, even before the North legalized it. Now, this is a point that I really want to touch down on, because, again, this is more of an educational episode, and I know that a lot of times we reference this three-fifths of a human, three-fifths of a man thing, and we talk about it wrong. Right. First of all, the North the North and the South, this dichotomy of moral versus immoral that continues to be spread and discussed in this very specific way, is exactly why we have Trump now. We can get into that maybe in a YouTube video, but it's based in these people not using the Civil War as this litmus test, as a PR statement to shape in their own truth, right? The three-fifths compromise, obviously, was something that did reference Black people, Black men specifically, and that their vote would count as three-fifths because they were three-fifths of a person. So it wasn't the weight of a white man voting. It wasn't one vote, 1-to-1, which is a white man. It was three-fifths of a vote. Okay, this is important because the North propaganda, we got to stop that here. The North likes to act like they were the more moral side. They weren't. Were actually encouraged to vote because if they voted, it would, again, widen the majority that the South would have in Congress and in the Senate because of the weight and the amount of people that would be voting in that region. Right? So people like to say, okay, they thought of us as three-fifths of the person. But really, the three-fifths clause was put on by the northern states in order to try and manage that majority that would be had naturally if a Black male vote was weighed the same as a white male vote. So they put in the three-fifths compromise so that that majority or that boom and that widening of constituents in Congress and in the Senate and all of that, they created the compromise so that, it would be a slimmer margin and we can keep things relatively equal. You see what I mean? That's told all fucked up. We've internalized, we've projected on it, we've discussed it in this way that's like, they told us that we were three-fifths of the man. The point is, we were allowed to vote. We were encouraged to vote. Not me because I'm a woman, but, Black men were encouraged to vote in the South so that the South could have more control over the federal government and the laws that would be passed. The three-fifths compromise was the North putting the kibosh on that and saying, well, they only count for three-fifths of a person, so technically we can still kind of keep things more balanced. Period. We need to talk about that. In 1870, though, the KKK was officially declared a terrorist organization. And this is probably a direct result to 1,500 Black people being allowed to vote in elections. I'm just saying. And after a riot in South Carolina, President Ulysses S. Grant declared martial law and suspended habeas corpus. He suspended habeas corpus for any suspected member of the KKK. And this was a huge blow to the KKK. And by 1872, the KKK was disbanded. Now, we're skipping ahead 4 years, boop, 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 and it's the election of 1876, right? The election of 1876 was probably one of the most consequential elections in modern day, I would have to say. The election of 1876 split both the electoral and the popular vote, and as a result, the Compromise of 1877 was agreed upon. The Compromise of 1877 said that the Southern Democrats, who now had the majority in Congress, would accept the Republican president, Rutherford B. Hayes, as president in return for the complete removal of the federal troops from the South, thus changing everything. Again, why are we not taught about this like this? You know my suspicions, Shao. You know my suspicions. But you see how the devil's in the details? This is how the federal troops are removed. And this marks the election of 1876, marks the official end of Reconstruction. Because once some federal troops were gone and the federal government didn't have the foot on the neck of the Southern population, you know the terrorism began instantly. Now, this is also the time of the Great Migration. This is part of the time when the Great Migration really started for Black people, because they were refugees. You know, people don't teach it like that, but they were refugees. People like to talk about, oh, the North had industries and factories and it was an economic thing. No, people were running for their lives because once the federal government left, they were fair game. They needed to be put back in their place. So Southern states and governments were free to do what they wanted with their Black citizens. And with their Black citizens, for the very first time, it was put completely in their hands without the federal government being there to make sure they stood by federal law and force them to. So, of course, instantly, Black codes everywhere. These codes will later be turned into Jim Crow laws and things like that. But the Black code specifically, early Black codes in, post the 1876 election were made and written in a colorblind way. But the practice of these laws and, protecting against these laws was only targeted and applied to Black people. This relates to slavery by another name, mass incarceration. I mean, I can go on. I think the most apt example is, in modern times would be the fact that crack was weighed differently than cocaine when they were virtually the same drug with the same effects. And that was knowingly because more Black people sold crack and more white people did coke. Similar thing. That's what they would do. They make these laws, but in practice, it would directly impact the lives of Black people way more, right? So the most important law of these Black codes was the law of vagrancy. And basically, it's the act of being unemployed. That's where that law came out of. Directly after this, boom, vagrancy. So they made it illegal to be unemployed, essentially, but they only made it illegal for you to be Black and unemployed, stuck in a lane of servitude. You could not be Black and unemployed, but you also had to go from job to job in a very specific way. And they were policing what type of jobs you could even work, boo. Even talking too loudly in the presence of a white person was illegal. Again, very subjective. These laws were very subjective. Anyone could get taken away. So there's this fear and suspicion around law enforcement that's really shaped during this time because anything could be illegal. Hence the self-policing, hence the respectability politics, hence these things that get baked into how we interact with each other and how we're able to exist in society, that we police each other on. because of shit like this. And boom, once the laws were in place, they were instantly exploited, of course, to create the new iteration of slavery, convict leasing. Sound familiar? Oh, okay. Because criminals aren't people. Criminals aren't people. Criminals are allowed to be people who had circumstances in their life that pushed them to do things. As we can see with this line of conversation, this history, this time period, a group of people that were formerly enslaved that were given no upward mobility, who the 40 acres and a mule conversation was instantly snatched up and given to white people. These people would need to do crimes, would need to do whatever they could to get food, to get work, to get a roof over their head that they could live within, right? A permanent lower class to be exploited and to be used as slave labor. And this is where the policing and the hypercriminalization came. This is where they started making private prisons and filling them up with Black people. This is where the prison boom began. See, my notes, my thought process. This is where the prison boom began. Okay, before, prisons were few and far between, and they were mostly filled with white men. A lot of people don't get this, because when it came to slaves and enacting justice against slaves, sure, there are cases where slaves were sued or put against a judge. All of that is true. But oftentimes the mentality of what a slave was like an animal, like a dog, like a pet. And if your dog did something wrong, it's up to the master to dish out the punishment that they see fit. So prisons back in the day were few and far between, and they were full of white people breaking white laws. It wasn't full of Black people. But now that was finna change, okay? So the fact that in the South, you as a Black person could be sent to prison for basically anything, and most of the consequences of these Black code crimes were punishable by fine that they knew your Black ass couldn't pay. Boom, hard labor. Boom, you're back to picking that cotton, boo. We're putting you on in the fields. Yeah, and that's how convict leasing started. Now, what exactly is convict leasing? Of course, I'll tell you. Let's discuss it. Let's put it all the way through. Now, do you know what a notary public is? I myself am a notary. I get some money, a little chicken on the side. It's a good side gig. But basically, a notary public is somebody who is working on behalf of the state to watch you sign legal documents. It is stamped by a notary public, which means according to their expertise, you are who you say you are, and it was notarized to prove that you are who you say you are. There's a whole thing you have to go through when you notarize a document. You got to look at someone's driver's license. You have to make sure they're the person. You have to, if they don't have their driver's license, they need 2 things that show their identity. All of these things are part of the process of being a notary public, but you're working on behalf of the state, but you can be a singular independent agent. I was working alone. I would do jobs alone. You can work in a UPS. You can work and be a notary anywhere, but individually, you can also work on your own as an agent working on behalf of the state, as long as you have your license. You simply get paid to vouch for the fact that the person who signed the document that you notarized was who they say they were. Like I said, I can notarize anything, anywhere on behalf of the state of California. Now imagine if I was able to do this and act within the same capacities as a notary, but instead of just saying, yeah, you're who you say you are, let me stamp this document, I'm able to write you up for committing crimes. That is exactly what a justice of the peace was back in the day. They functioned very much like a notary, but they were a notary who could point out people. They were people who could point out and police the community they were a part of. They were certified to deliver a judgment or a sentencing to a crime that was committed, and they could use that whenever and however they wanted. You see how this is starting to get messy as fuck? Okay. See, back in the day, it was rare for the state government or even the federal government to care about what goes on in local communities. So the justices of the peace were purely in charge with dealing with the local disputes in communities and handing out judgments and working on behalf of the community. The issue comes in when the justice of the peace could be a shop owner, could be a baker, or it could be a plantation owner, former slave owner, farmer who has land that needs to be worked. This is where we start to run into some real problems morally, right? Because if you're someone who used to own a plantation and now that you have to pay your workers or whatever, you can see how instantly this power can be exploited to continue to enslave Black people. Let's continue. Also, weirdly enough, police departments were also few and far between during this era. You know, in rural areas specifically, if you were not a big city, you did not have a police department. You had an elected sheriff, and that sheriff was purely kind of an administrative job. The sheriff deputies, much like the justice of the peace, worked on behalf of the sheriff in a similar way to police the local areas. So the justice of the peace, the sheriff deputies, and the sheriff in these rural southern areas worked very differently than the formal police departments that they would then become, if that makes sense. Let's describe how it would go. Let's play it out from top to bottom. A sheriff's deputy would catch a Black man walking along the train tracks, give him a ticket. He's going or coming from work from his job because they likely did not make enough money to buy a ticket to ride the train or whatever, so they're walking along the train tracks, which is illegal now in this new Black Code era. The sheriff deputy would catch this individual, take them to a justice of the peace who just so happens to be his neighbor, and they both just so happen to have farms that have land that need to be worked. Suspicious. The justice of the peace would charge him for being guilty of whatever they could, whatever they are being accused of, and boom, another one sentenced to hard labor. But of course, they also had to work off those court fees. You know, you went to court, people were working, you have to pay the court fees for that. You can't afford it? So that extended your sentence. Mind you, this is going on right now as we speak. I'm just saying, this is still happening. This is still very much a thing. It's different in certain capacities, but the basis for what's going on in those private for-profit prisons is this makeup. The government didn't care. They were not making a ton of money off of this convict leasing situation, but it was the perfect way to keep the Southern economy from completely collapsing upon itself, obviously. So they kind of turned a blind eye and they were cool with it. Even though they were still engaging in slavery, it wasn't technically slavery, so it was all good. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, every Southern state had convict leasing programs, meaning 12 years after the end of the Civil War, slavery was back on the menu. In fact, it was not only back on the menu, it was even more accessible and affordable than it was before it was outlawed. How does that make any fucking sense? These convicts weren't leased just to big corporations. They were leased to anyone that could afford them. And since the convict leasing made it cheap to have slaves, essentially, it actually made it much more affordable to have a slave. For one, you could house and feed your slave. They were only a few dollars under the convict leasing contract because, you know, it's part of the prison system, right? Which de-incentivized people to even care about taking good care of their slaves anymore. A normal slave used to cost hundreds of dollars as compared to only a few dollars a month for a whole fleet of slaves for that price. They were not treating these people well. Some weren't even starving these people because at the end of the day, if one of these enslaved people who were convicts drop dead, you can get 50 for the price of one slave before slavery was outlawed. Does that make sense to you? You tell me. It's not making sense to me. They didn't change slavery. Slavery never stopped. They just renamed it and actually made it more widely accessible. There's no need to tend or care for the sick or the hurt because you could just replace them. Much like the sugars in Central and South America and the Caribbean, we could just replace your ass. So work till you're dead. I don't give a fuck. These people were being treated with even less care and even less dignity than when they were slaves. Okay. But it gets worse. Let's talk about something called debt peonage that fits directly into this situation perfectly. So, of course, going back to the original example, when the justice of a peace would charge you and you would either get hard labor or have to pay a fine, let's go back to the original example, right? You're put in front of the justice of the peace for walking on the train tracks, and they're offering you a sentencing. Either you're going to get a sentencing of hard labor through convict leasing, or they're going to give you the fine, right? Okay, you can't pay the fine. Obviously, if you could pay the fine, you probably wouldn't be walking along the train track. Well, maybe while you're there, some wealthy landowner, business owner comes to you and says, yo, I'll pay your fine for you. You say, thank you. And in order to pay them back for the fine that they paid for you, you would work on their farm. Okay, fair is fair, right? Except it wasn't fair, because now it's not just convict leasing and a sentencing to a set amount of time through the government. Now it's individual on individual. Now it's a civil thing. You paid my fine. I agreed to that. And I agreed to work on your farm to help pay off the money you shelled out for me. Well, they're not taking into account that this person's going to say, well, you may think you paid me back, but guess what? I fed you, I clothed you for 5 years. So now all of that is added onto your time. You have to pay me back for that. And because the longer you're there, the more resources you need to continue to survive there, the more food, the more clothing you're going to need. So you're not really paying anything off. And a lot of people who were caught up doing petty crimes, petty theft, small things, were stuck on plantations for decades because they were stuck in this cycle and no one gave a fuck about it because the economy was moving. And this time in history is where things like confessing judgment became popular, which is another way to say a plea deal. You just say you're guilty instead of taking it to trial because you already know you can't afford the court fees. You already know you can't afford that. So you say you're guilty, you take the hard labor, and you're instantly going to some person's plantation in the South. This is not just a blip in time. This is how the Southern economy continued to chug along without modernizing, without getting into things like technologies and industry. This, making slavery legal, was how it was able to continue to exist. So just again, to clear it up, plea deals were created to make slavery faster after slavery was outlawed. Okay, that makes sense. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, but it did not have a punishment for continuing to do it in the Constitution. Let me repeat that. There was not language in the 13th Amendment about punishments for those who decided to continue to enslave people, no matter how they did it. So they could not legally do anything to these landowners who were benefiting from convict leasing and all of these new ways to enslave people for decades and decades and decades on their plantation. They couldn't legally, federally have any legal recourse to these people to do anything. Half-assed. Now, this is super interesting, and I want to kind of start to end things at this note. What's interesting is before neo-slavery took its real effect in the South, right? If you asked a white Northern person to describe a Black person, you would get someone describing like an Uncle Remus type, a jovial, loyal, simple kind of person who was kind and funny and maybe musically talented, but, simple, like a dog, someone that you would have to direct, someone you would have to lead. But if you trained them right, they would be a great companion. After neo-slavery, though, if you asked a Northern white person to describe a Black man, they would say things like dangerous, threatening, criminal. The South used these Black codes to spin Black people's PR without them having any agency or control about how they were being perceived, right? Oh, look, these Black codes come into law and all these Black people are in prison. We have to start building new prisons for the amount of Black people in prison. These people are criminal. These people can't be trusted on the streets. All of that gets played at the same time, that psychological shit, that all of these laws are happening. What I just described to you is happening. And at the same time, they're playing PR games and they're pointing and saying, we have to build prisons for these black people. They used to be good in slavery when we were in control, child, but now they're just criminal. And they use that to create this positive feedback loop in changing the perception of what a black person is in the cultural zeitgeist to be threatening, to be criminal. Because you don't get rights if you're a criminal. And now we have a base of never-ending slaves in a society that's supposedly post-slavery, because now we are taking criminals off the street and we're doing the good thing. We're fighting the good fight. These criminals, these blacks cannot be trusted. So they need to be in convict leasing programs. They need to be in prison. But really the point is to continue slavery. And you see how all of this is old, dusty, crusty. All of these talking points were created in order to create an image that black people never had any control over in the first fucking damn place. To create this image so that eventually it creates this positive feedback loop to put more people into prison, to put more people into bondage so that they can continue to exploit this population and make PR and make things, in the cultural understanding of what a black person is. So now, not only are you enslaved again, but I don't give a fuck because you deserve it, because you're a criminal. They had to build prisons for you blacks. So that's why you deserve to fight fires in California and never be a firefighter. That's why your ass deserves to be picking fruits and working in fast food joints and never see that paycheck. That's why you deserve that, because you're a criminal. Not understanding that the word criminal is branded, that the word criminal is created by people. It's giving Mad Men. It's giving ads. It's giving PR. It's giving that. It's giving constructed. It's giving incepted into your mind to mean something that it never really intentionally was. And that's how that's supposed to allow to continue to happen, by keeping y'all dumb, by purposely keeping this information for people who are studying this specifically or willing to go into debt to get an education, or your really incredible history teacher in high school is just passionate about telling you guys the truth. It's all subjective whether or not you get access to this information or not. It's not democratized. That shit is behind a paywall to make sure you don't understand the truth. Because now if you understand that the concept of a black criminal was created in modern history to reflect the need to fill in the slave labor gap that was stolen due to losing the Civil War, now the concept of what a criminal is and what a criminal isn't gets funky. Criminals are not supposed to be people who deserve humanity. And that's because criminals are supposed to only be black people. They're not supposed to be white people. And you see that all the time with how they mythologize and how they discuss certain bad actors, certain bad situations that continue to happen. Even when a white person unprovoked goes on a shooting spree to Asian massage parlors in Atlanta, Georgia, the cop immediately after these people are murdered for nothing in cold blood says that he was having a bad day because they can't be seen as criminals. A criminal is black. The word criminal, the idea of a criminal in our modern conception of what that means is only supposed to be a black person. So in the South, at this point, it wasn't sexy. It wasn't cool to say, you're black, you can't vote. So what they did was create a workaround. They implemented poll taxes, which many black people couldn't afford, and literacy tests, which many black people couldn't pass, in order to make it very hard for any black person to be able to vote. And even that is subjected to the white person supplying the test or the white person taking the payment. It's up to them to decide whether or not, even if you gave them the money or passed the test, to be moral and say you did those things. Even that's subjective, right? So meaning virtually no black person could vote. Meaning there was no black representation in politics at all after the end of Reconstruction. You could not be called for jury duty. So there was no jury of your peers, only white people, white men specifically. Let's bring it back to Emmett Till again, plugging the YouTube channel, YouTube episode on the Emmett Till case where I talk about this specifically as it relates, and that was 1955, y'all, as it relates to Black people in more modern times. But you couldn't participate at all in any kind of civil society activities. Your civic duty you cannot do. This is a time when lynching became even more popular. Like I said, popular enough for the schools to be let out early so the kids could catch that lynching. Things got so bad that the Green Book was invented in order to guide people, Black people, through driving across the country, where to stay, where to eat, and even where to get gas. The last Green Book was printed in 1966, and my grandparents have several in their house. Several original ones, okay? My grandparents who are still alive have Green Books in their house. This is how close it is to our modern society. It wasn't that long ago. Now, you want to know what ended this cycle of oppression? What ended this situation? Pearl Harbor. What? History is so weird. History's so weird. So just a quick history lesson. If you didn't know the truth, we didn't really care about what was going on with World War II in Europe and, in Japan and in China and in these other places in the 1930s. We didn't really give a fuck. We were on our isolationist teas, right? And basically, World War II started to brew. We didn't care about the Jewish people. We didn't care about shit. We didn't give a fuck. We were staying out of that shit. We were in the Great Depression. Things were happening. We were not focusing on it. Then obviously in 1941, Pearl Harbor happens. We obviously have to enter the war at that point according to what they did to Pearl Harbor. Obviously, this is also why we came out on top, because we weren't fighting since 1933. We came in 1941. The war was over in 1945. So, the military might, the people, the death count on our end, we were fresh bodies in that situation. So we were able to not only add reinforcements to the Western European countries, but we were able to end the war. Again, if you want another plug, I have a YouTube video on the true crime story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have my distinct opinions about using the A-bomb on the Japanese people, but that's a conversation for another day. We're deciding on, we were on the war PR kick. We were the good guys. We were coming in. We were saving everyone. We were ending the war. We were doing this thing. We couldn't be the good guys and have this debt peonage thing lingering around with how we treated Black people in the country. So swiftly and quietly, Roosevelt created Circular Memo 3591 on December 12, 1941, which essentially spoke to how they would change the classification of debt peonage to involuntary servitude or slavery and then prosecute it heavily in order to end this illegal trade in labor quietly. And it worked. So by bombing Pearl Harbor, the Japanese freed us from debt peonage. History be weird sometimes. According to official record, Alfred Irving, 1942, was the last chattel slave to be freed in 1942. I'm doing this in quotes because, again, slavery still exists. The last slave that they'll say, again, air quotes, was freed around 80-ish years ago, a little over 80 years ago. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended segregation in name alone, but boom, here comes Nixon with the war on drugs. Do you understand what the fuck I'm saying? Let's go back to that timeline, right? The last official that they put on official books as a chattel slave was freed in 1942. In 1964 and 1965 is when Black people were given their full rights in this country. Again, air quotes if you're not watching, right? Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. Ended segregation, so they say. So they clock in our history books, right? But immediately after, we're in the Cold War and the war on drugs begins. Nixon, the war on drugs, all of these things start to happen, right? As a direct result and crackdown to the civil rights movement. This is a quote from someone who worked in Nixon's cabinet. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either black or against the war. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities and those organizations. So when we look at history as a true crime story, predator and prey, victim, murderer, however you want to classify it, what we see is times where we're able to escape and then times when we're dragged by our foot back into the hole. It happens so often, this ebb and flow, this white fear that continues to control us. This white fear of the mediocrity and the reign coming to an end, that can be employed even in 2024 to make people make reductive, stupid, regressive ass political moves. And here we are. Here we are in 2024 having Trump walk into his second presidency with little resistance. He's already started discussions about mass deportations. He's already talking about heavily suing media companies for how they spoke about him when he was not president. He's already gearing up for things to go back to this way. They have their white claws in our calves and they're trying to drag us back into that fucking illegal bunker. We're not going back. Not to quote Kamala. No, not in that Kamala Harris way. But bitch, you're going to have to kill me. I'm just saying. You're going to have to kill me. We are not going back to this bullshit. But you see, like all this time when the election happened, sorry, I'm going on a little bit of a diatribe as we conclude, but as the election happened, all these people were invited to roundtables on network news to talk about how much of a failure the Democrats were and why they think it failed. And all these white people refuse to talk about how this is just how they do. We are not able to progress as a society because of y'all racist ways and the white myths that you create to hide y'all racist ass ways. You are deluded. You are brainwashed. You are smelling your own fart and thinking it's perfume. That's your stilo. But we are stuck and captive in this situation where it depends on what side of the bed y'all wake up on, where we're going to go. Are we going to move forward or are you going to drag us back? What era are we in? And we're in the drag back era. Once Obama became president, child, ooh, we should have known. They were going to crack down and drag us by our wigs and put us back in our place or attempt to, child. So with all this information, think to yourself, when was the last slave freed? Honestly, be serious. Because we went from chattel slavery for over 400 years to neo-slavery just 12 years after the Civil War ended, and through convict leasing, then debt peonage, then straight into mass incarceration. So when was the last slave freed for real? And is slavery still a thing? Is anyone free? These are important questions we gotta ask. I knew when I was creating the series and researching for it, I needed an episode like this to bridge the gap because a lot of people don't understand how we hop from the end of slavery to where we are today. A lot of people refuse to understand that Black people never had a break. The foot was always on the neck and it's still on the neck. We are in the midst, it's not just harder for Black people in America. We are in the midst of an active genocide in a country that normalizes slavery and almost exclusively exists and thrives on it. How does that change how you engage with your existence in America, especially as a Black person? And how does that change how you engage with how you exist in America as a white person? What more do you not know? What more have you been ignoring because you've been able to sit on the laurels of Black people be dramatic, Black people be sensitive? Is it sensitive or are we just telling the truth? All I gotta say, y'all, ask why, pull that string. White myth making is the real thing we're fighting in this country. And we gotta get it from the root and pull it out and tell the truth. Because that's the only way we can stop with this cyclical thing of progressing forward only to take 120 steps back. I'm tired of it. Are you tired of it? Follow me on my socials, link in the bio. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to like, subscribe the video, comment down below, put that bell notification on. Link in the description to follow all my socials. TikTok is getting banned, y'all. So follow me on all my socials. I want to make these more active communities. Love y'all. If you're listening purely in audio, I love you, audio fools. Make sure to 5-star this podcast, rate it, tell me what you think, tell me what you vibe with. But we are coming to an end to the Bloodstained podcast. I think I'm going to end season 1 with 10 episodes. So we have 2 more episodes after this. So yeah, I'm super excited. I hope you guys have a happy holiday season. Much love into 2025. Thank you for a wonderful year of the Bloodstained podcast, and season 2 is going to be even better. Mwah. Much love. Black Lives Matter. Free Palestine until it's backwards. Love you guys. Mwah.